Hey everybody, this video is a 4-step guide to taking high ground. I hope you've practiced some of the building tricks that I've talked about in other videos, because rather than explaining how to build those things, I'm going to talk about when to use those tricks during each step. Before step 1, you have to learn to recognize buffer tiles. To do that, let's look at the reach of pyramids. From wherever you're standing, you can put 8 cones below you, above you, or on the same vertical layer. If I want to block a player with a cone, I have to stand somewhere on a tile next to theirs. For example, from the far side of a corner tile, I can still block this player because I'm standing on a grid space that touches theirs. If we move to different positions on the grid, I can't block that player anymore, even though the linear distance between us is much shorter. That tile in between you and your opponent is what we're going to call a buffer tile. And the first step to taking high ground is breaking into that buffer tile. A high ground opponent who plays safe will often climb 3 or more layers above you and just spray down on you. If the player is that much higher than you, cone jumps, counter classics, none of that stuff is going to work until you're close enough. Climbing into that buffer tile is the easy part. All you have to do is cover your head while climbing up. Double ramps, protected 90s, or Thwifo Cones will work just fine for this. As you reach the buffer tile, though, you have to switch to unblockable building patterns, which brings us to step 2, forcing the counter climb. The only way to prevent a high ground opponent from blocking you is to cover your head with as many floors, ramps, and cones as possible. To accomplish that, make sure to practice double edits and cone turns. Once the high ground player realizes they can't block you, they have to start climbing with you in order to keep their high ground. This is a good thing, and it brings us to the third step, interference and misdirection. Once the high ground player starts climbing to stay above you, you have to start using more difficult building patterns. Your goal here is to throw builds as high as possible to slow down or trap your opponent. A good way to do that is by looking straight up to place an extra wall above you. This high wall gives you a bunch of options and can even be placed during a protected cone jump. Here's what that looks like in slow motion. And here you can see just how quickly that extra wall interferes with high ground. You can also use these high walls during 90s to keep yourself protected and to give yourself cheeky opportunities to trap your opponent with cones. In addition to your interference builds, you also have to keep climbing and turning unpredictably in order to misdirect your opponent. The more turns you make, the harder it is for the high ground player to keep up with you. A building sequence incorporating interference and misdirection might look like this. Consecutive cone turns, followed by a counter classic with an extended Thwifo cone into a highly protected cone jump. If you can learn to improvise with sequences like this one, you should be finding the opportunity to reach step 4, the retake. If you did a good enough job misdirecting and blocking the high ground player, you should find a chance to safely crank 90s and take high ground for good. Sometimes this is as simple as cone jumping and ramping over your opponent. While you do your protected cone jump, and oh my god, that was so pretty. Once you have high ground, you need to protect it. Build cones and floors above your opponent to block the retake attempts and to find offensive double edit opportunities. Standing on cones also gives you right hand peek angles on a climbing opponent. Alright, while I'm up here, I'm just looking to block this guy. All my building patterns from high ground are pretty simple. Right, I just want to stand on floors and cones, right? If I'm standing on this cone and this guy gets up to just a tile below me, right, I can find a right-hand peek angle from anywhere on this cone, see? And just like that, I can take hexacle out of the game. If you see the player trying to take back high ground, you can jump, land into a 90, and start cranking. Retaking high ground is hard. If you're not sure what to build, you might never make it to step 4. That's why it's important to practice retake sequences. The goal of any retake sequence is to use common low ground building patterns to take you through all 4 steps of the retake process. Here's an example. In this sequence, I start out in a double ramp and I place a floor and cone. That's step 1. The double ramp protects my head and the floor and cone break into the buffer tile between me and the high ground player. From here, I can reach step 2 by editing through the floor and cone. At this point, the high ground player realizes that I'm climbing fast and that I cannot be blocked. That forces them to start building up with me. That takes us to step 3. By editing this top ramp, I surprise and misdirect the high ground player by switching directions, and then I interfere with the player's builds using this wall and cone. Hopefully that was enough to slow the player down, because the next part is the actual retake. A protected cone jump, 180, followed by ramps and cones above my opponent. Here's what it looks like when you put it all together. Try to practice retake sequences like this one. Once you've got the muscle memory dialed in, you can start improvising. Depending on how your opponent is playing, you can add Thwifo Cones, cone jumps, cone turns, double edits, all while following the same basic 4-step formula. If you'd like to see more retake variations, more explanation, or just a specific sequence in slow motion, come join me during my live streams at twitch.tv/Billy_Bicep. I will answer all of your questions, and we can even hop in a creative lobby if you'd like some free one-on-one coaching to figure out the next step to improving your gameplay.
Really freaking bicep. Oh my god, dude.
Thanks for watching. Thank you all for using code Billy-Bicep in the shop, and I hope you all start enjoying high ground. 1 Thwifo Cone, 2 Thwifo Cone, 3 side jump, and he's blocked. It cannot fail. It is a foolproof strategy. Good fight, man.